Now on to Mars. Mars's name in Sanskrit is Kuja, or Mangal. A good mantra for Mars is Om Kum Kujaya Namaha. Another good mantra that I enjoy using is Om Shri Skanda Namo Namaha, which is a mantra to the incarnation of Mars, which is Skanda. And this is something that's worth exploring, the mythology of the planets. It gives you a better understanding of how they work and what they're about. We cover this in the Myth and Magic of Vedic Astrology course, available at Asheville Vedic Astrology. It's one of the longer courses, but it does break down the planets, looking at them individually, their characteristics, looks at how we can understand them through their history and myth, and how we can relate to them as conscious energies within and a part of us in the greater universe. So that's a good thing to explore. But anyway, with Mars, he's an interesting planet because he is a malefic and he can cause harm. However, he's also a good planet in that he allows us to learn how to work hard. When Mars dashas come around, oftentimes they can be some of the best dashas, depending on what house Mars rules and where Mars is situated. But overall, the reason this is, it's because Mars only has one enemy, and that's Mercury, which means that unless he's getting aspected by Mercury or in Mercury's sign, more than likely he'll have the help of his friends, Sun, Moon, and Jupiter. And the reason people consider the Mars dasha to be hard is because it does require hard work. Mars is a malefic. He makes you work for the things that he wants to give you. And if someone has a weakness within their chart where they're not able to work hard, or they don't feel confident or have enough courage, well then, of course, the Mars dasha can be difficult because he's calling you to develop your courage and to come forth and achieve these things that he wants to see come into fruition in your life. And if there's fear, or if there's difficulty trusting oneself, well then, yes, the Mars dasha can be difficult. But anyway, what are the natural characteristics of Mars? Well, Mars is quick and decisive. He's a very independent planet. He loves his freedom. He's also good at standing firm when challenged. He's the warrior. And he's the warrior in the sense, not that he goes looking for fights, but that he's about defending Dharma. He's about upholding what is true. When we have a bad dignity Mars, or a Mars in a difficult position, difficult house, or under difficult Lajatatiya Vashta, say with Mercury, or in the same sign as Saturn, well then Mars can pick fights that aren't worth it. And we can see this in any of the Vargas. If we have a difficult Mars in the Navamsha, which deals with committed relationships and marriage to a degree, then we might pick fights within our marriage that aren't really useful. So when Mars is strong, he fights, and he fights well, but for a cause that is just. When Mars has problems, then he picks fights that aren't worth fighting, and that's where we get a lot of difficulties coming in with Mars. So Mars is good. We need Mars. He gives us courage, he gives us drive, he gives us initiative, but he can be bad and give arguments, disputes, aggression, and violence when he's frustrated, when he's not allowed to express, or when he's in a difficult position. So remember that about Mars. And again, this is something that we go over in the Myth and Magic course, the incarnation of Mars, which is Narasimha, the man lion, who's able to overcome all these obstacles to destroy this demon and save Prahlada, one of Vishnu's best devotees. But his anger is for a higher purpose, which means once that purpose is served, he can let go of it and be returned to peacefulness. So we always have to remember that. Mars gets a little bit of a bad rap, but that's only usually when Mars is in bad situation. But that's really the same for any of the planets, if we think about it. Mars likes to be direct, assertive, and outspoken. In the chart, it represents our energy, our potency, our ability to train, and our motivation. Venus represents the body's ability to recuperate and be strong. And when we go exercise, we break down muscle, Venus gives the capacity to rebuild it, to regenerate. But Mars is that motivation to go to the gym and to get better and to refine skills, to hone our capacities. And because of this, Mars is associated with technical or mechanical ability, which is often why a lot of engineers have a strong Mars, or people who are interested in sports, competitive situations, or problem solvers have a good Mars, because Mars gets in, he likes to see the problem and fix it. So fixers usually have a good Mars because they can pull things apart and see what needs to be put back together, how to make it work. Mars is said to represent our younger siblings. He also represents our teammates. So if we want to see how do we get along with our siblings or our teammates, we can check the status of Mars in the birth chart. And again, we'll learn how to check all these things as we go, as we put these steps and these foundational principles together. You can also look at Mars in the Drekana, which is the primary Varga for Mars. There's a few other Vargas too, but the Drekana dealing with siblings and how we relate to our teammates to move forward and overcome obstacles, or just create a band of people that come together that share the same interest. How do we get along with these people? Mars, he gives a number of different kinds of careers and interests. Since he is a bit of a militant planet, he can give an interest in the military and police and self-defense, and vocations that involve working with fire and metals, chemicals. Mars can be a bit willful, harsh, and unyielding. But Mars is also active, open-hearted, and generous. So Mars wants to take care of those people that he's in charge of. But when it comes to training or developing a certain task or developing a certain skill, he can be this unyielding, willful individual, or unyielding, willful energy. And that's why sometimes if we have Mars with one of the nodes of the moon, such as Rahu, that can show that we need to work on developing the healthy use of our willpower. So we need sometimes to be harsh. Sometimes we need to be willful. Sometimes we have to make a decision. We have to use our instincts to make something happen. That's part of our God-given self. It's part of who we are. We all have this. And the better Mars, the better we will use this in an appropriate and timely manner. Mars is difficult. We can be harsh and willful consistently, repeatedly, when it's not called for. And that's when Mars acts negatively or poorly. A weak Mars can also give lack of courage and determination and the ability to take initiative. Now, Mars owns the signs of Aries and Scorpio. Mars is exalted in Capricorn. And Mars has its fall in Cancer, or its debilitation in Cancer. And the element of Mars is fire. Okay, so let's consider some other aspects to Mars here. When you are considering Mars as a concrete thing, as a karaka, as an indicator, Mars, let's just take an example of Mars in the 10th house. So the 10th house deals with career and what we're known for. So if we have Mars in the 10th house as a natural indicator, that can get us involved in police work, as a soldier, as a commander, as a surgeon, as a barber, chemist, engineer, anything that takes mechanical ability, or anything that uses a cutting apparatus, such as a surgeon or a barber. Mars also works well with heat and fire. So someone who works in crematoriums or kitchens. In kitchens it's hot. In kitchens we often use knives. For many years I would always check people's charts to see if they had a good Mars, if they invited me over for dinner, because personally I really enjoy food and I like cooking. And so I want to make sure that if I'm going to go to dinner, that I'm going to get good food. Now, I'll go anyway to be polite, but I like to be prepared. So if you want to know if someone's a good cook, check to see if Mars is influencing that skill within their chart. And if Mars is strong, more than likely they will be a good cook. Now, Mars represents wounds and injuries, instruments of cutting and piercing, as we've said. Mars represents violence, blood red colors, youthfulness and vigor. Oftentimes a person who has a prominent Mars will seem very youthful, or they will look like they retain their youth as they get older very well. Mars is a planet of sexuality, but more so the passionate side of sexuality, that more animalistic side of sexuality. Whereas Venus is more the intimate closeness of sexuality. And when we get these two together, then we have the passion, the animalistic instinct, with the more beautiful side of sexuality. So that can be a very good combination when it comes to having a good lover, Mars and Venus together. Or if Mars and Venus are in the same house, look to see what house that Mars and Venus are in, and that'll help to show you what is the person passionate about. Now, Mars's direction is south, the southern direction. And as far as castes go, he represents the Kshatriya class, or the warrior class. Now, when we're considering things such as the Lajatati Avashtas, or specific aspects of ourselves with Mars, we can determine our integrity and our character through Mars. This is one reason why, say, Mars is considered to make a person a thief or a valiant warrior. If Mars is in a negative state, then the person just takes whatever they want. So their character or their integrity can be less. If Mars is in a positive state, then this makes someone who's defending others. So it becomes more of that noble warrior aspect. Mars represents gold and gems, and gemstones primarily. So if you have a nice strong Mars, you'd probably benefit from gemstones. And if Mars is influencing financial houses or houses of gains, that can show that investing in gold or investing in gems can be good for you. Mars rules your siblings, the nervous system, neighbors, weapons, overseers. And what are overseers? Generals, bosses. So these might not necessarily be authority figures that you look up to, but people who watch over you, manage you. Mars can also represent the results of our enemies' actions, surgery, and logic. A good strong Mars will give good success through surgery. It will also give a good mind for logic and figuring things out. Now, surgery, I've seen this happen almost all the time, to be honest. When someone has a good Mars, they usually benefit from surgery, which means if they have a problem, someone can go in, cut it out, works great. If someone has a weak or difficult Mars, surgery causes complications. So you have to test this out on your own, but I've seen it work enough to mention. And that kind of takes us to that whole idea that each planet represents something in particular in regards to how we can improve ourselves. And so the better the dignity of each planet for that particular planet, whatever it represents, that can be better to improve ourselves. Again, in this case, surgery for Mars or gemstone therapy for Mars. Now, when we're considering Mars, we also need to look at the Vargas. And again, as I mentioned, the primary Varga for Mars is the Drekana. Now, there is another Varga, which is important to note. Let me pull up my notes here. And that is the D27, the 27th Varga. Because this represents our skills, our general strengths and weaknesses. So Mars is the primary Karaka within that Varga. Mars gives the capacity to logically and effectively use and apply your skills. So if you have a great Mars in the Drekana, a great Mars in the D27, the Bamsha, then more than likely you will apply your skills in an intelligent and effective way. If not, you might not do so logically, and that can cause some problems and difficulties. Now, also for Mars, we need to consider what does he represent on a little bit more general level. Well, he can represent how we defend our convictions, or what we think about our convictions. Meaning that if we have a debilitated Mars, for example, then we might have this idea of how the world should be, and it can be out of line with how it actually is. So if you've ever known anyone who thinks the world should be this way, and they fight for it, but really it doesn't make any sense, or it doesn't line up with experience, and they never seem to get that, well, that can show a Mars in bad dignity. If we have Mars in good dignity, then that allows us to see how things actually are, which means that you know what is worth fighting for, as I've said, but you also really truly know how things should be, or how things are, I would say. So Mars in bad dignity, that can give you someone who has a lot of ideals, a lot of shoulds and shouldn'ts, and they might live by those, and they might make them miserable, and they might make other people miserable because they're trying to live by these shoulds and shouldn'ts, which aren't realistic. But if you have a good strong Mars, this makes a person who has a very good capacity to know how things are and how things really should be. Not in the sense of an ideal that we're reaching for that is unrealistic, but just in general, when we're looking around at certain situations, when we're dealing with people, we're not placing our judgments on them. So I guess we could say Mars definitely represents our judgments. Mars is negative, we can have bad judgments or unrealistic judgments, which can cause a lot of suffering for ourselves and others. If we have Mars in good dignity, then that gives us better judgment. Again, we know how to pick our fights, and we know how to logically interact with others in a way that makes a little more sense. Now, Mars in the different houses, or in the Rashi in the birth chart, when he's interacting with a particular house, what is he going to possibly represent, or what is his energy going to be? So if we look at Mars in the first house of the Rashi, of the birth chart, Mars represents our character and our sense of right and wrong. Again, going back to what we just said, debilitated Mars, the sense of right and wrong might be skewed or inappropriate. The character might be a little off. Mars is strong, then we get a good sense of right and wrong, a good character. And of course there'll be variations in between. And we will also get help from our friends of Mars, such as Sun, Moon, and Jupiter, and hurt from Mercury. So we have a little bit of, we need to consider how it can be adjusted. But overall, this is what Mars would represent when he's ruling the first house, when he's influencing the first house, and when he's aspecting the first house. Now the second house, Mars can show our mineral wealth, or how we logically manage our resources. Why? Because Mars rules minerals, the second house rules wealth and our resources. Mars rules logic. Mars also rules our ability to manage things logically. The third house, Mars represents siblings, peers, bravery, and our capacity to train. Again, if Mars rules the third house, influences the third house, aspects the third house, then we're going to consider these things: siblings, peers, bravery, and training. The fourth house, Mars rules land, houses, property, mother. One way we can start thinking about this, and why mother? Well, that's a Gemini thing. We're not going to get into that, but Mars can rule the mother for particular reasons. But if we think about it, if we have Mars ruling the fourth house, and we have Mars in the 10th house, that's a double signification for doing work or taking activity to manage property, houses, and land. So real estate, landlords, these sorts of things. Why? Because the fourth house represents those things, and Mars as a Karaka represents those things. Now we have a double indicator there. If we had, say, Saturn and Saturn ruling the fourth house, and then taking that Saturn and putting in the 10th, well, by the very nature of Saturn ruling the fourth, it could get you involved in land, houses, and property, because again, that's what the fourth house represents. But Saturn in and of itself doesn't necessarily have that natural Karakaship as Mars does. So this is how we start to see more specific trends or possibilities in a more accurate way. If we have the Karaka, Mars ruling land, houses, and property, ruling the fourth house, which is land, houses, and property, so that's two indicators, in the 10th, which can give a career or activity in that regard, then that's a stronger indication that that's going to be true for the person. If we just have Saturn ruling that house, which isn't a specific indication for land, houses, and property, then it doesn't deny the capacity or the possibility of that occurring, but it makes it less, because you see it's not lined up as much. So whenever you're assessing a chart, the more something lines up, the more chances that it's going to be true. But everything's going to have some sort of convolution or overlap that doesn't quite make sense. So again, what we have to do is, as we go through the chart, we have to see how many times does something show up. If it shows up a lot, 4 or 5 indications, it's pretty safe to say that's going to be true. If it shows up once or twice, it's a possibility. Keep that in mind. For example, when we get to Saturn, Saturn in the 4th house deals with pets. So having the ruler of the 4th being Saturn in the 10th, well, the person might be more involved with pets, for example. Now, let's keep on moving along. So 5th house. Mars represents convictions and the strength of our opinions. Now, we've already talked about this in general, but the 5th house is our mind and how we think about things. And it is our opinions to a degree. So Mars ruling the 5th, if Mars is in the 5th or rules the 5th and he's in good dignity, well, the strength of his opinions, his convictions will be strong. He'll be able to defend them logically. They'll be correct, I would say. Mars is in bad dignity, bad situation, ruling that house, in that house, well, that can make a person more opinionated, not in a good way, but more annoying and more difficult. Their convictions can be a little over the top or overbearing. 6th house. Mars rules accidents, overcoming enemies, and weapons. So accidents, overcoming enemies, and weapons. So how do we overcome our enemies? Well, look to the 6th house in Mars. Mars is in the 6th house, good dignity. We overcome our enemies well. Mars is weak in the 6th house. Our enemies overcome us or give us more difficulties. Again, these all need to be weighed with a number of different things, such as the Baladi Avashtas, which I've already done one video on, the Jagrati Avashtas, Lajatati Avashtas, but we're just giving you the basic framework now. Remember that. 7th house. Mars rules challenges in relationships. Why? Because Mars likes to improve things. So Mars in the 7th, he can give problems, making a person too challenging, too frustrating, or he can stimulate the relationship to greater things, depending on the state of Mars. So challenges in relationships. 8th house. Mars deals with surgery, battles, and war. The 8th house is the house that deals with battles, our vitality. Mars is good influencing this house. Surgery works well for us. We might have intense battles, but we fight them well. We might get involved in war, and we fight well. Negative Mars, the opposite. 9th house. Mars is said to rule the brother and sister-in-law and our moral code. So always remember that. You want to see if a person has a good moral code, look to the 9th house, look to Mars in that regard. That'll give you an idea of it. You want to see the relationship to the brother and sister-in-law, look to Mars in relation to the 9th house. So if it's in the 9th house, it rules the 9th house. 10th house. Mars rules command and overseers. If you've got a good Mars in the 10th house, you can take command of things. You can command others. You also take orders well, too, which is good. Got a difficult Mars, well, you don't take orders so well because you want to do it your way. And you don't have command of others because you probably get too frustrated with other people. Our overseers. Well, Mars, he likes freedom, and he likes to do his own thing, but he respects authority and power. So he respects the king. He's the general. And the sun is the king. When the king is noble and just, Mars will follow that king, and he will obey. When he finds that his overseers or his king isn't just, well, then he won't follow that king. So when we're looking at the 10th house in Mars, if we have a good king, if we have a good leader, then we can follow orders well. If we don't, that's when we're going to have problems. 11th house, Mars. Character and motivation of group dynamics. How well do you get along with group dynamics? How good are you at team building? That would probably be a little more 3rd house, but how well do you get along logically with larger groups and organizations? Do you cause problems? Do you stir things up just to make problems? Or do you try to improve the organization or participate in quality improvement? Mars does like to improve things. So this deals with group dynamics and organizations. Bad Mars, you frustrate the group dynamics. Good Mars, you support the group dynamics logically. 12th house. So these are the results of the enemy's actions and our secret enemies. So again, Mars ruling the 12th, Mars in the 12th, aspecting the 12th. The state of Mars will show us the results of our enemy's actions. So whether that's fighting them, boxing, or a court case, or just someone you don't like, you want to see what's going to be the result of clashing with this person. Mars is good, it works well. Mars is bad, you picked the wrong fight, basically. Secret enemies. Is some intrigue going to come up which is going to bury you? Or are you going to discover that intrigue where it's not going to harm you at all? Again, look to Mars in its relationship to the 12th house. And again, when I'm talking about its relationship to the houses, this will make more sense the more you think about it and the more you practice astrology. With any of these planets, these indications that I'm giving, they are to be taken as though this planet rules that house. So if this planet rules that house, that's what you can start to look to. That's an indication that you can look to get more information about that particular thing. So in regards to Mars in the 10th, command and overseers. So if Mars rules the 10th, Mars is in the 10th, look at the state of Mars. That will show you the overseers within your life and your own capacity to have command. And we need to start tying these things together, because if we don't, then we're just going to be looking at people's charts and thinking, well, I don't understand, I'm so overwhelmed, what does this mean, I don't get this. So what I'm trying to do here is just bring it in a little bit. So when you're thinking about a planet and you're thinking about its placement, you've got a little more guidance. And these are not considered to be exhaustive. They're not considered to be every possible combination. They're just meant to get you thinking about what these indications possibly could be. So we don't want to overwhelm you, but we want to get you going on the right path of considering how to think about these combinations or these influences between planets and these influences between houses, because you need to look at them all to get the overall picture. Okay, so anything else about Mars worth noting today? Okay, so again, to review, Mars represents personal character and integrity, represents our relationship to exercise, represents accidents, surgery, the nerves or the nervous system, our sense of sight. It's not the eyeballs, but the actual sense of sight, so it's in line with the sun there, with the vision. The fire element, electricity, the prana, or the electricity in the nervous system, vitamins and enzymes, and marrow. Now these are all important to note because there's a number of things that we can use these planets to consider. And if we look at the Logitati of Ashtas and we see that Mars is again afflicted by Saturn, starved by Saturn, so the nervous system is again afflicted by Saturn, which represents either the ligaments or the connective tissue. So maybe the connective tissue or problems in the connective tissue in the body are causing nervous system problems. If Mars, the nervous system, is again supported by one of its friends, such as the sun, well then, the sun represents minerals within the body. So Mars represents vitamins and enzymes. The sun represents minerals. So that can show that the mineral content of our body, and the moon even, the moon representing blood and the fluid within our body. If Mars is again supported there, well then the nervous system is again properly nourished, because Mars, the nervous system, is again delighted by its friends, the sun, the minerals, and the moon, the circulatory blood system, blood supply. And this is one of the ways that we can start to see how these different avashtas can tell us more about the person, their health, certain relationships. If Mars is starved by Mercury, Mercury is its only enemy, and the reason I use Saturn for starvation is because, as you'll learn about the Logitati of Ashtas, Saturn starves any planet that it's with. So even though Saturn isn't a natural enemy of Mars, when he's with Mars, he will starve him. So conjunction. But getting back to Mercury, if Mercury is starving Mars, then we have Mars, which can rule our relationship to our siblings and our teammates, and Mercury can rule our friendships or our capacity to communicate. So Mercury starving Mars can cause difficulty with our teammates and with our siblings due to communication issues. So these are some things that we can start to think about. All right, well, this was a little bit longer than we wanted to do, but it's all right. That's Mars, and next we'll be looking at Mercury.